He's like a butterfly flapping his wings deep down into the forest, man. It's gonna cause a tree fall like 5,000 miles away, man. There ain't nobody seeing nobody. Man, see, like, you don't even know, man. It's like you're born into this world, man. And you got like that, man, the dust and wind, man. Or like the dang old candle, man. It don't matter, man. It's all the time.
All right, Matt, welcome to the Jay Burden Show. How you doing, man?
Doing excellent. Thanks for having me.
Yeah, this is one of my favorite things about being on social media, which is, by and large, complete waste of time that is hazardous to your health, is that every once in a while you get to discover just cool things you had never heard of before. And you were going back on social media with a few friends of mine. I saw it, and I was exposed to your work for the first time. And it was really interesting. I immediately bought a copy of the first volume and was just head over heels with it. I thought it was the coolest thing ever. And the fact that I had never heard of it at all was, additionally just kind of, it felt like a great injustice. And so if you could just describe, briefly who you are and, what's your project?
Yeah, I'm Matt C on Twitter and sometimes on YouTube, like now. And I create a graphic novel series called Kyrie, and it's an Orientalist fantasy in the great traditions of those kind of works that are love letters to romance of the sands, probably Greco-Roman, intensely, like rigorously researched and yet high fantasy kind of legacy works that I don't see enough of, particularly in America, where we get it's completely understandable, but we get the genre of comics and the genre of superheroes and the medium of comics confused here. I grew up a bit overseas in Commonwealth countries where we're reading Tintin and Asterix and that sort of thing, and you realize, over there, it really anywhere outside of our beloved country, comics is a medium. It's just like novels. It's a means of conveying any kind of genre and exploring. Generally, historical fiction is what they traditionally love. So I'm trying to bring that to American audiences because we love it. Americans love this as a genre. They just don't see it enough in the graphic novel format. So,
yeah, I'm glad you brought up Tintin because it was hugely impactful to me. My grandmother grew up in boarding schools, all across the world during the 1950s. And so obviously, his work was very popular. And so she passed that on to me. I read them voraciously as a kid. And the romance of Tintin is something I noticed in your book as well, which is this is a world of highly distinct cultures that are still highly distinct, that there is none of this kind of homogenization that, you go to China and you see, I was going to say I guess that's a slur now. I didn't mean it to be, but Chinese people, right? Not Chinamen. Sorry. I didn't mean it. But you see someone who is connected to a culture. When you go to Arabia, you see Arabians. And that's so exciting, right? That is the feeling that the world is a vast place where you can discover different things and different types of people. And reading your work, that's something I noticed as well, that you see different characters. And even if it's not directly stated, it's like, oh, that's someone from a different kind of culture. You see, obviously, in the first book, a large Byzantine influence. And I don't know a ton about the Byzantine Empire, but I could tell you did, right? The costuming, the armor, the arms is very well done. And so I find that sort of the idea of a still mysterious world of distinct cultures just really exciting. It makes the world feel adventurous again. If you see what I'm getting at there, Matt.
Yeah, absolutely. Kyrie is set right smack in the middle of the 3rd century. And for you guys who think about ancient Rome a lot, that's the 3rd century crisis epicenter. And Rome was going through a period that I think is intensely relevant. Everybody's got their favorite era. I like these transitionary periods in Roman history. And I like that there was a dark like a subterranean religion that was drinking blood and talking in weird languages about dead people, and that was Christianity. And Rome was worried about what that would do to civic religion if people became atheists, is what they called them. The Christians were the first atheists, and that kind of anxiety was intensely that Decius and other religions or other emperors took that personally. It was also a time of where Roman citizenship, Roman identity was expanding, and the people were trying to figure out so we've now got more people who identify as Roman who have opted into the system, so to speak, or maybe consider Rome to be an economic zone or something, right? And now we don't know, can Rome exist when more of Rome is people who have immigrated into Roman identity and civic virtues and values. While at the same time, you've got an influx of religious identities, notably from the Middle East, that seem to be in conflict with Roman religious identities. That's a lot of what I'm playing with in Kyrie. Is there's Christian characters in the story. I never identify them as so. I never try to see it through their lens, because that would be too easy. I'd always try to see the Christian from the perspective of these different, more established cultures and worldviews in the 3rd century, and what they have, their suspicions, their anxieties, which reflect all the just the fun competing stuff that was going on in that century. It's a really fun time to play stories with it.
Well, and this is obviously an earlier era, but there's a detail in the book of Acts. It's the episode when St. Peter, basically God tells him, you no longer need to keep kosher. Story's not entirely important, but he's staying at the house of a centurion. And the detail is the centurion of the Italian legion, right? That was a special thing, that the legion was composed entirely of Italians. So even during the 1st century, you see that the Roman army being made up entirely of Latins, right? That is sort of ethnic group that started the empire, was notable. Now, fast forward, 200 years plus or minus, you see that trend continue. Sorry, random detail came up in my reading. Had to get it out there. This is another actually sidebar. I do love French graphic novels. Not at all what we're talking about today, but over the past 10 years, they've been going through, can't remember who it is off the top of my head. It's an incredibly French name, has been going through Michael Moorcock's work, redoing Elric, those first couple books. And the graphic novels are impeccable. It's very, very well drawn. If yours is sort of a PG to PG-13 rating, these are R to NC-17. The content level it's out there, so I wouldn't recommend it for everyone, but they're incredibly well done. And I don't know a lot about that, French graphic novel culture past, the big names you mentioned, Asterix, Tintin, and then that. But it's sort of, again, kind of interesting to look in and see what other people are doing with the medium. But before we get into it, you've obviously put an immense amount of time into this. 3 volumes, 450 pages. So how do you fund that? I mean, did you go to, DC, to Dark Horse and say, I've got an idea, and end up with a check, or did you pursue an alternative path?
In the distant past of the mid 2010s, I did have an imprint publisher, a digital first publisher that was trying to do I'd say Kickstarter. Indiegogo didn't exist then, but Kickstarter had already had almost a decade under its belt of demonstrating that people could go and crowdfund works, and but the success rate of fulfillment wasn't meeting people's expectations, I think, which is entirely understandable. It's it's not a storefront. You're not a customer. You're you're not quite an investor, because what value are you getting back for your investment? You're a backer. The lawyers created this a new category of a backer who could help fund, again, not like purchase things, but they could fund things that couldn't get off the ground without that backing. And by the mid to late 2010s, people were trying to figure out how to augment or structurally support that framework by saying, well, let's go digitally first. You can read them on like a webtoon style format that was big at the time, and or on other people had personal sites where they were running this sort of thing. So that's what I was doing for a bit, and then 2018 happened, and people just said, no, let's just run for. There was a movement called Comicsgate. You may have heard of it. People were just like, there was enough of an exodus, like an immigration out of the mainstream comic, ecosystem, where people were migrating into a properly indie space of self-publishing and saying, let's just take some risks. I don't have to see the entire thing in a PDF before I know that you're the sort of person that I want to back, or sort of thing. So a lot of money got thrown around. It was as people probably know at this point, if you could do the postmortem, I don't know if there was any more success in the Comicsgate space than the crowdfunding before that. It was about 50-50 fulfillment rate, I feel like. But I was playing in that space as well, and but it's easy for me because I write Kyrie, I draw Kyrie, I letter Kyrie. I get when I get backing, it's just for a print run. So my costs are relatively low. But I'm an outlier. There's really can I say the R word on your show?
Look, I've said Chinaman. So as far as getting flagged, we're already there. You're good.
You have to be rich, rare, or retarded to make something, complete it, and then try to sell it to a virtual audience that you don't yet have. That's insane. Even traditional publishing doesn't do that, right? So selfishly, I'm putting myself in the rare category just because I'm a solo creator. Most people can't do that. A lot of people, and most of my bookshelf is full of people who collaborate on things, and those are usually where the most interesting stuff happens. Is you get the result of that, like, creative combat of writer and artists and the development team who put stuff together. They usually can't afford either they're either rich or retarded. So crowdfunding is meant to address that and just say, well, let's not remortgage your house to print this. Let's throw a few thousand into developing something. Let's see if we can drum up over several months interest and support for this, so that we don't get one-shotted by the bill and never try this again. And if we can get 300 people to invest to back with $20, then that will cover the rest of the risk, and then more stuff gets out there, more outsider projects get out there, stuff that mainstream would not publish gets out there. So crowdfunding is really fantastic, and it remains, I think, a very viable sort of thing for people to try out.
Well, and I think that what it allows, and you've seen this with other forms of media as well. I think of like video games. I don't play many anymore, but you saw the same thing sort of slightly earlier, which is that it enables funding for an area that the market, whether that's because of collusion, there's only a few big players, or just people aren't paying attention, or when that market creates a blind spot, it enables someone who knows it, who knows comics, who knows games, to say, we should make something like that.
Mhm.
No one is. And I don't need to convince a company. I don't need to, walk down to Mr. Microsoft's office and, give him a firm handshake and say, give me $1 million. You could just put it out there. And we've had some profound successes, obviously notable failures as well, as, it always is the case. But Amanda, to me, when I said I was very surprised when I stumbled across your work, I was surprised not only because of its quality, but because it was like, this wasn't volume 1. You've done this several times serially and apparently successfully, right? There are still books there. And that's really cool because oftentimes, right, as you've said, these projects, even if they're finished, they're ambitiously done. Maybe it's just too difficult or too expensive. And so you get the first out there, it drops and you're like, awesome, that's great. Maybe there's some areas for improvement, but then it's just done. The project is done. And yeah, man, I think it's very cool that you've been able to do this. So when we talk about, this and why this couldn't have been made by, sort of a legacy publisher, why is that? Like, is it a content? Is it simply the form that you're producing it in, one giant book per volume? Like, why was this something that needed to be produced on the kind of indie level?
I think when there are only less than half a dozen publishers in North America who are doing graphic novels, and the graphic novel market being mostly captured in the 21st century by like gender kind of coming of age, sexual awakening kind of novellas for feminine audiences generally. They're just, and that does sell to that unique market. But if you want to do something again that like people do in Brazil every day, they do in Japan, obviously, and they do in Europe, where you could explore. It's not just the genre that couldn't be printed in America because the capacity to sell beyond those two markets, the graphic novel market, which is just catering to a single audience, and then the superhero market, which is just catering to that other one. It's also, I think, the idea, the auteur idea that the Franco-Belgians continue to celebrate, where you have a discrete story and it's going to go for as far as the creative team wants it to go, and then it's over. Even like Asterix, which is like enormously serialized, like it only continues to go if the family that owns the IP says that we want anything at all to happen to it. They can make a lot more money than they do. It's kind of like Calvin and Hobbes here in America. Like, imagine if everything that you ever bought comics wise was like Calvin and Hobbes, where it just starts and ends when the creative team decides. And I feel like that's super important. That's really the magic dust, I think, of indie publishing, of proper self-published content, where is this inspired by something that is kind of like a micro topic, but they feel that it is accessible to all ages and would be exciting to a lot of people who have been exposed to that as a genre, young adult ancient Roman fantasy. That's a clear win, I feel like, but it's just an underdeveloped market in America. It's going to take someone it's going to take people who are kind of weird enough to kind of commit to it and do it just for the love of the game before they have a contract. If they never get a contract at all, at this point, I literally don't care. I'd actually prefer to just be hand shipping these things every weekend. It's more fun. I wouldn't be able to sign them if I didn't hand ship them. And that's a key. It just briefly touching into the space that I think folks might be interested in. Like, it's not just crowdfunding. It's not just indie publishing. It's also this weird, wild world of like creative culture influencer publishing. which is fascinating in itself. It's not a world that could exist without the sort of technology, where the internet has gone over the last 10 years affords that kind of thing. And so there's this fun, I think it's really interesting, this fun sort of tension where so there's people who want to make books, and then they go online and they develop a YouTube presence, and you can go to one extreme, and then the publishing is just like merchandise that you buy that supports the YouTube creator. And sometimes people have problems with that. I don't have any problem with that, but there's a fun act. It's the sort of dilemma that you actually get from a living, thriving, dynamic sort of emergent ecosystem that you clearly do not have. You do not have with HarperCollins or Penguin Publishing. Nobody is coming out here. They've been afraid to for 10 years, and they will continue to be afraid because they're dead. As a publishing venue, but this is where the fun stuff, this is the frontier.
I think you're completely correct. And I've noticed this because I'm primarily a literature guy, right? That's the sort of media that I think I know best. And I've been really impressed and encouraged by the success my internet friends, for whatever that's worth, have had in publishing. Like my buddy John Slaughter, his debut novel was a sort of a noir detective story, sort of a love letter to that sort of pulp fiction. And it was very, very well done. It was really cool because that this is something that no one ever would have greenlit. It's that sort of genre fiction, that sort of thematic content, which I was not at all didactic. Part of the reason why it was so good, but it's just like you couldn't justify, quote unquote, spending HarperCollins money on a project like that. Similarly, I think of my buddy Carl Dahl, who's wrote an adventure story about the Spanish Civil War. And that book's great. It's awesome. Yeah, like I wish this book had been around when I was 12 years old, because I would have thought it was the coolest thing ever. I still kind of do now, if I to be 100% honest. But like that's a risky thing, because it's like, okay, do how many people really know about that? Okay, then how many people read historical fiction? How many young men read historical fiction? You're getting kind of further and further down. And you can understand why a company that is huge is only going for, to be honest, books that are designed to be sexually interesting to women and, things like that, right? The kind of like low, like, cheap smut that sells, tons and tons of copies. In addition, I think that, and tell me if I'm wrong, this is my guess about comics, because you've seen this with Dungeons and Dragons and Wizards of the Coast, where for the big publishers that have access to superhero properties, they make so much money from other things than comic books that the comics are sort of ancillary, and it doesn't really matter if they're good or not. In the same way that for Wizards of the Coast or Hasbro, they make so much money on Magic the Gathering that all of these other things, Dungeons and Dragons and others, it doesn't really matter if they're good or not. I mean, it does, but like they're basically like vestigial. And I don't know if that's true about comics, but from looking at it from the outside, that's what it seems like is going on. Like it seems like it's not really being run in a way that you would run a business you really cared about. Am I overextending that, Matt? This is a pure conjecture. I'm just guessing.
Yeah, that's what a lot of the commentary has reached a consensus on, really, is that as far as U.S. mainstream comics goes, they are a loss leader that just kind of allows these parent corporations to park IP ownership over these properties unless they can option it to something that actually is profitable for them. If they can they can workshop something that can be spun up into a TV episode or something, or they can put it in a film, then they'll do. Then it's just kind of like a Skunk Works sort of place, that sounds exciting. That sounds like the place of limitless possibilities that get explored. Unfortunately, that's not the case with mainstream comics generally. I think they're at a weird tension point because they decided America is so unique in this respect because they decided to buck the trends, to not go with the norm where everybody else was just creating, author owned properties until, Hergé dies and then you get no more Tintin, right? Like that's normally how these things go. In America, we decided, and we marketed this very intentionally. We bred an audience to understand that these characters are not owned by their inventors, so to speak. They're the writers and the first illustrator who created Batman has no ownership over who Batman is. Everybody, in a way, owns them. Like the corporation owns them. So it's like it's for-profit American myth in a way. It's an IP, but it's something that we all get to own in a sense. It was an enormous. It was a brilliant marketing tactic. Well, but when they were able to, because they did that, then Batman lives forever, and now you have a canon. Now you've got lore. Now you've got 80, 90 years of stories that people are increasingly expecting for you to pay deference to, and they don't want to pay deference to them. They want to chase where the money is in the short term, which creates that sort of adversarial relationship, I think, between Hollywood execs, these parent companies that Hasbro too is the sense that I get with Magic of the Gathering, and then the people who actually buy them. They're always saying, can we just convert? Can we just trade in our existing audience for a potential audience that we feel like who is not yet interested in what we're doing, but could if we appeal to them in the right way. It's never a good move.
Well, and honestly, I feel like a lot of the, should we say, like online media commentary around that dynamic sort of lets the audience off the hook for their complicity in this as well, which is the like, no, I think this is true. It's part of the reason why because I think a lot of people who ended up in the kind of more, shall we say, dissonant space on, politics, philosophy, or art, even if we didn't come through Gamergate or Comicsgate, that was a factor somewhere along the way. For instance, like I'm a little bit younger, but I got taught Gamergate at the collegiate level. Like I had to go to a course called Critical Theory of Video Games, knowing nothing about it. Wow. I left that basically saying like, whatever you are, I'm the opposite. And so that's how I found, all the people you're probably thinking of. But point is, I think there's a trap in staying there where you are sort of addicted to these like legacy franchises. And many of these legacy franchises, like I have my attachment to the same as anyone else. But that kind of common myth owned by a large corporation, it's like if that's all you consume, you're missing out. And if that's all that you're paying attention to and you just want the best quality version of that, it's like, well, okay, like that's certainly better than what we've got now, but that can be kind of like ossifying or stultifying. That can choke out creativity because everything has to be part of one of the big canons, And so in a weird way, I look at this and I look at the death of traditional publishing, the death of, many of these franchises as weirdly kind of a good thing. So for instance, in the tabletop gaming space, which is the last part of me that I had to like choke out my attachment to any property someone owned. And 40K was the last one. I'm done. I've been clean for a while now. That's the last one I held on to.
Yeah.
And you've seen that company in particular both increase the amount of, so we say, like social commentary, but also just over financialize the game, go after people making fan art, creativity in a way that negatively impacted their product and has pushed those people elsewhere. So for instance, you have the rise of, like all of these alternative tabletop games. Trench Crusade got embroiled in some, political controversy, but there are dozens of others where it is designed to be open source. It's designed to be something you can work on. It's designed to be something that, sure, you can buy our miniatures if you want, but you can use, your old tin soldiers, you can cut them together and that'll work too.
Nice.
It creates a sandbox for creativity, both in an individual level of like, hey, here's a new system, but also now you have a whole group of people who are used to supporting independent sculptors to make, miniatures, or independent rule makers. So you have this incredible breadth of different things to, choose from, which has two effects, which is one, you have as a consumer more options, but also now you've created a system where creative people can support themselves, can create without basically being a slave to, big GW or big comic, whatever. And so, look, man, like, institutions are important, especially for making culture over time. But in the current situation we're in, like, it's almost an own goal from their perspective, that they sort of strangled the golden goose and pushed capable, competent people into a position where they are supporting themselves by their creative work. And I think that that's kind of cool. Like, it's not done yet. It's not at the point where it's like exactly how you'd want it. But like, compare that to 10, 15 years ago. Like, I know your project's been around for 10 years. Maybe we should go a little bit further than that. But still, like, to me, it's kind of exciting in that way. Am I overstating it, Matt?
No, I think you're exactly right. I think understanding the volatility of traditional markets, and especially at this point, the demonstrated ability of industrious people who are not averse to risk taking, capitalizing in this market and doing some really fun, exciting, original content, and filling our bookshelves with things that make bookshelves exciting again and make them unique again. You're not just merely buying something at Barnes and Noble, which is my era, to demonstrate that you have the approved classics on your list now. Now you go visit friends and you see their bookshelves. You're like, I have no idea what I'm even looking at. And that's exciting. Like, or you've got, I didn't even know this guy published. Where did you get that? Is this on Amazon, or is this on some other publishing platform entirely? I need to understand. I need to know. Kind of feels like the early world of, it's probably what the Apollonian, the entrepreneurial intellectuals of a few hundred years ago, what it felt like to engage each other's bookshelves again. It's a fantastic time to be publishing.
Yeah, and I think as well, like, look, there is sort of a selection or a survivorship bias we see in publishing, which is generally most people aren't aware of just how much trash was published, but just either no one bothered to save it or no one ever talks about it. And look, I am a firm believer in the cycle of civilizations. There is such thing as a better and a worse culture. But I think someone would look at like the should we say somewhat checkered results of crowdfunding and say, well, only 1 in 3 or 1 in 2 gets to XYZ success criteria. And it's like, I mean, honestly, man, there are a whole lot of comics that only ran a pilot and maybe a couple issues. Like, there's a whole lot of failure, and there is very much a sense of kind of like, if you're unwilling to fail on a creative level, you are never going to do anything at all. And so when I look at these failures, and it's actually funny you mentioned this, I remember probably the only time I've ever bought YouTuber merch. I was maybe 19, and a prominent YouTube account, I won't name it because it's kind of a nasty thing to do, wrote a novel. I was interested in the concept, bought it, and it was absolute trash. It was genuinely one of the worst things I've ever read in my life. And so you can look at that one of two ways, which is, one, I feel like I got ripped off, but also it is kind of cool that you can totally fund your first novel and at least get it out in front of everyone. And so I have no idea if that guy wrote more after that. I'm not sure if I want him to or not, considering the fact that I feel kind of personally aggrieved for reading that. But in all seriousness, right, it's like you have the opportunity to pitch yourself in a way that is very, very unique. And you don't have to be in the room, right? You don't have to get a seat in front of, the head of publishing. You can just do it. And I don't know, I think that's very cool and very exciting. And it enables something like what you've done, which is a product I never would have thought about. Like, you would have given me like 10 years to come up with like, hey, what's a cool setting for like a fantasy adventure, I would have probably never gotten to this. Like, it just wasn't, in my wheelhouse. And it enables that to be, I guess, kind of funded by the market. I don't know, man. I think it's super cool. So let's pivot slightly to the actual story itself. We talked a lot about like the atmosphere surrounding it. So if you could just kind of give us you could say like a thumbnail sketch of your book.
Yeah. So in a way, it's my dialogue with Alexander the Great, who the classic authors considered him to be, in some way, the worst and the best of us. And in transitionary periods like the 3rd century, it's a very appropriate time to be engaging with a figure that that divided Romans so distinctively. There are seminal periods when people would, when leaders, Octavian visited Alexander the Great's tomb, and apparently he may have stolen his nose from his mummified corpse. There's a story about that. Lucan, who is he's one of my favorite 1st century authors. He plays in Nero's period with a lot of fun. He might have written the first fantasy novel about visiting the moon and seeing creatures there. He says Alexander was a mad son of Philip, and there's a lot of allusions in his work to Alexander being a prototype of Nero himself, and Nero, of course, humiliated and then assassinated Lucan. And then we've got in the 3rd century, we've got figures, Roman emperors who some of them were probably clinically insane, who thought that they were the resurrected, the reincarnated embodiment of Alexander. And why were they doing that? I think there's something really there's something kind of amazing that there was a guy who studied under the very best that Greek philosophy could have, and then actually lived with the Iliad under his pillow, so to speak, and then went out and tried to live like Achilles, and arguably pulled it off, and that's what the 2,300 years have been about, whether or not he pulled it off, and in his own lifetime, people felt like he had betrayed Achillean values, and yet people were divided on that. I think it's fascinating that that Rome, while in a way it's kind of a Promethean modern civilization that decides that it wants to step into an age of iron, in a way, and it wants to be pragmatic. It wants to appropriate anything that will make money. It's not particularly interested in virtue, even like its greatest contribution to literature is cynical critiques of political figures. It's not inventing comedy or tragedy. It appropriates Greek culture and takes what it wants and just disregards what it doesn't. It's like a chimeric figure that we live, under which we live in the shadow today, and yet it was obsessed with Alexander. It was absolutely obsessed from the top down, and so I wanted to write an Anabasis of sorts, the story of like what it would mean for if you could look at the history that we do know, that we can put like little pins on the map to. And then we've got the gray areas in between that we could potentially draw strings between these pinpoints. Could you tell a story where Alexander is actually tempted in a real sense of having his greatest desires fulfilled, of having, immortality, of being one with the gods? And would he be willing to, what would the cost of something like that be? What would be the extracted resource that the gods would ask of someone like Alexander in order to pay for that? And would that cost be too great? And really, I think that's why the Romans were interested in him. It's a culture that believed it was founded on fratricide. So they were very aware. They had a very cynical, realist outlook on their origins and their future, and they understood that, it's very beautiful in a way. They understood the struggle of being founded in that capacity, and I think they appreciated identifying with Alexander because he the cost that he undertook just on the historical level was immense, and he may have sold himself out in the quest for his own ambitions. And I think Rome was constantly, it's why Rome is so fascinating. Rome was continually interested in whether or not it was selling itself out. It was very interested. It was conquering, and then it was constantly asking themselves introspectively, were those Gauls, were those noble barbarians really better than us? They were constantly in dialogue with that. And it sounds very much like Western culture for a reason, because we intentionally inherited that. We just have a little bit in amnesia on that front. But so that's what this is. It's an all ages comic that's playing with those ideas. Yeah, I suppose I should pause there. Did you pick up on, did that shine?
Yeah, oh yes. Well, that's why I liked it. I'm always intrigued by, and Tolkien is sort of made worse by his imitators, if that makes sense. Where it's like I hate that I live in a world where I've read 100 derivations of him before I got to him, if that makes sense. But in much the same way that there is a for all ages does not mean like cheap or, like lowbrow or irritating. It means that there is a sort of exo and esoteric reading, not in the sense that there's like a bunch of occultism, but like there is a plain, easily apparent story which can be understood by children, and then additional layers that adults will pick up on in a way that it provides additional meaning, right? It's not necessarily there to explain the whole thing, but like you get more from it. And that's something I really appreciate in your work, and I'll throw it back to Carl's. I feel like I described it as a book for children. It is not. It has the same all ages quality where you could hand it to someone who is 12 and not, scar them or scandalize them. But also, as an adult, you don't feel like you're wasting your time. But I want to slightly pull back to talk about Alexander, because he's weirdly mentioned quite a lot in Umswell, which is one of my favorite books by Ernst Junger. Sorry, if you're wondering why I turned off my camera, I had to go find my copy and then find the section of the book I wanted to talk about. But in this book, it's sort of as is often in Junger's kind of post-war books, it is semi-autobiographical science fiction, in quotes. I mean, it's not really science fiction. It's just, a near future world, right? And in this world, it's sort of this micro state, on the fringes of, kind of the warring empires. And the Kasbah is sort of this like rock fortress city state. And their central cultural figure is Alexander. So from the very beginning, he's talking about how his very respectable liberal family hates the idea of Alexander. So I'll read it here. So for somewhat context, he's talking about how his own family is uncomfortable with their historical legacy. Somewhere in their history, they have someone who was notable, and they don't like the fact that this character, their ancestor, is kind of constantly reinterpreted to fit the politics at the moment. So just a little bit of context there. I'll get into it. First of all, this is understandable. They are perturbed by the way their ancestor is customized to fit current politics. Furthermore, it is an outstanding personality that makes them squirm. Alexander strikes them as an elemental phenomenon, a lightning bolt that is sufficiently explained by the electrical charge between Europe and Asia. There are bizarre congruences between liberal and heroic historiography. So point is, he's basically saying the kind of like very cynical reading of Alexander is, simply a result of, trends and forces, that there is nothing transcendent to him. It is simply just, it could have been anyone. I thought that was interesting. But another thing they describe, which is somewhat similar, this is much later, talking about how the civilizational myths which beget your culture sort of ultimately lose their potency. Again, talking about Alexander. I owe to Vigo, a professor, not important, one of the geological findings in Umswell. Fellow like swamping on an Alexandrian foundation. The substratum was Alexandrian knowledge on a classical foundation. Thus values keep growing more and more shallow. First they were present, then still respected, and finally annoying. Before our times, they still had an afterglow. The stove is cold. It no longer even warms the hands. And I think that that's sort of an interesting idea as well, that, that founding story in the Roman context of, patricide. By the time you get to the 3rd century, like there's still a core of it there, but it has grown to encompass more and more. And are there true believers? Yeah, somewhere. But does it still have that kind of sacred flame? Sorry to get a little chin stroking there, that it did when it was new and bright. And, when you look at even, the Eastern Roman Empire is sort of another example of that, which is like, well, it's named the same thing. And there is some cultural continuity there. And let's also acknowledge the weird irony of Rome itself splitting into 2 sort of brother empires, right? Kind of going back to the very beginning. But I don't know, I think that's kind of a fascinating meditation on the way in which you treat like a founding heroic figure. Like, do you view him as sort of transcendent and greater than, or simply a man? And then once he becomes just a result of trends and forces, just a, inevitable result of history, that spark fizzles out. There's sort of nothing to it. You sort of lose the heroic in that. Sorry, Matt, that's a massive tangent from a book that I like that you probably haven't read. So it's probably not particularly helpful to quiz you on it, but I'm curious if you have anything you think.
I haven't read it, but that's fascinating. It's the group chat has been popping off lately about Alexander and Achilles. His Alexander's like his patron saint, so to speak. And it reminds me, it's so intensely appropriate to understand the Iliad and to understand Achilles, to understand Alexander, the historic Achilles in a way. It's so appropriate that he idolized Achilles, because Achilles, it's a tragic cycle for many reasons, but one of the reasons it's tragic is because Achilles should be the prototypical warrior who embodies the civic virtues of the Greek city-state. He continually shirks that responsibility up to a point. Why does he go on a murderous, very anti-Greek killing spree? Because he was hungover from the night before, and Patroclus puts on Achilles' armor, does the Achillean thing on behalf of Achilles, and dies for it, dies for his pains. And so it takes Hector of the shining helm, obviously being elevated as a pillar of civic virtue, to know he's going to enter the battlefield dying, to lose. He's going to lose, and he considers it his duty to enter that battlefield nonetheless. He embodies, in losing, that civic virtue that is the one key thing that Achilles does not have, is being submitting to virtue even in loss, so that by winning and by desecrating Hector, and he ends up shaming himself. Hector post-mortem teaches Achilles virtue, which actually allows the tragedy to turn into something of a spark, a silver lining of hope for that entire cycle, and elevates Achilles, of swift-footed Achilles, the guy who embodies, like, in himself, he has the potential to be the hero that he should be. It's in his it is description, and yet he can't become that until he loses by winning his way rather than in the virtuous way. And Hector has to teach him that. And that is something that it is, I think, is embodied in Alexander's, like the historic Alexander, but just as importantly, the mythic Alexander cycle. Like that, there's so like people, there was so much fanfic written in antiquity about Alexander that they considered it important to capture and to qualify and to explore and to project those mythic archetypes. And they figured that Alexander, being like a embodiment of Achilles in a way, is someone that they could hang those archetypes on so that they could discuss it as a civilization of the great, classical tradition. And they weren't so worried about whether or not it had to hang on, modern categories of historicity, because they knew it was true. The categories that Alexander was plagued with, Alexander being bigger than just a man, because they knew that Achilles was plagued with those things. And so I think we should be telling Alexander stories. It's just like that complexity of like, is it tragedy? Does it turn into comedy at the end? Where does the turn of like, do all things come together for good? Or is this merely hubris? That is the Achillean cycle. And you've got a guy who lives by that and ends up falling in a way because of it. And if there's anything more romantic than that, I haven't found it. Romantic in the capital R sense.
Certainly. And this is something that the postmoderns are kind of right about. When I can't remember who it was. It was, let's go with Derrida. We'll say I can't remember. The idea of, it's awful when you read a book, you can't even remember who wrote it. But the idea that the Gulf War never happened, that there's both a literal historic event, the actual event, but also the experience everyone had of it. And that becomes more real, hyper real, one might even say, in the actual event itself. And you see the same thing with the heroic, that, yeah, there is a literal man there. You have someone like, in our modern context, someone like Jefferson. And it's like, well, are there bad things about him? Are there things that were kind of embarrassing or, could have been better? 100%. But the heroic sort of transcends that. And this is something that I love from Carlyle, right? The idea that hero worship is the essence of civilization. That the idea of seeing something that is bigger than you, seeing something that you're seeing something great and saying, I wish to be like that. I want to emulate like that. Or I want to emulate that. And even, you have the case of, Robert E. Lee, right? Who felt that he was a failed imitator of Washington.
Yeah.
Well, yeah, 100%. Like he probably was, but also like that, you need that sort of striving for greatness. And so you have men like Napoleon, right? Who sort of weeping that he was not the man Alexander was. And look, does that mean that there was a literal man from Macedonia named Alexander? And did he do all the things that are attributed to him? Well, I mean, probably not. He probably didn't literally cut the Gordian knot. But he as a symbol has become something much, much greater that can animate a civilization, that can lead people forward in the way that this kind of like narrow, cheap, realistic, and reasonable version of history completely covers up. And this is something you see in Lewis, actually. He talks about this, where all throughout it, you see it in The Pilgrim's Regress, but this idea that the type of kind of modern, and I mean that with like a capital M perspective, that wants to look at every single person, every man, every historical figure in the most kind of like cheap and nasty way possible, because that's what it's realistic. The kind of like George R.R. Martin view of history, where everyone's a horrible bastard. Everyone is always doing these evil things, but that's how it really is. It's like, well, that's partially true. Like you're seeing a facet of reality. But if that's all what you focus on, it completely robs the world of any transcendence, of any heroism. And when we were talking about comics earlier, I was actually thinking about this with regards to the kind of darling comics of the 1990s. Something like Preacher, for instance, which I mean, there's parts about it I actually kind of like. I think there are parts of it that are pretty good, but the nihilism you see there, that no hero can be a true hero, the best you could hope for an anti-hero. To me, that makes that story feel very empty at the end of it. And it doesn't need to be saccharine, and it doesn't need to be, this kind of like 1950s television where, everyone sits down for dinner at the end, because there is tragedy. There is the tragedy of Achilles. There is the tragedy of Alexander. Things can go badly, but this kind of like nasty, snarky version of the world, to me, it feels very, I don't know, kind of dead now. It feels very, I don't know, kind of acidic. And so I don't know, Matt, that's a massive digression from me. But to kind of put a bow on this, read his book. It's really good. It's not even expensive. Give it to your kids. The art is good. The story in it is, as we've said, heroic and romantic in a way that you don't often see. And obviously, the author's pretty smart. So there's some decent stuff in there you can pick out. So yeah, Matt, sorry, I guess I should give you a chance to respond to my rant there.
Yes, absolutely. Yeah. Well, and again, I mean, this gets back to self-publishing in a way. And like I almost wanted to go with like Tintin as the Neo Alexander. We'll put a pin in that. Like we're this like interesting like this voluminously charged bubble up sort of ecosystem where now like there isn't just a call to action. Now we're like years into demonstrating all these varying and oftentimes in a way competing kind of emergent responses to the lack of good storytelling and like I've learned this word retrouvement, like recovering the need for stories to begin with, like, and having a like properly oriented kind of like principled desire and a adventure in discovering and writing stories that we get to own as a culture and aren't just owned by IP farms. I think it's a thrilling time to be writing, to be reading. Every previous era seems dimmer in a way, even though they were incredibly better. Just would we even know who Tolkien was if we were in 1940s England? We could actually have these authors from the past more accessible in a limited sense than we could in their own era because of the medium that we're on right now on YouTube, because of the kind of the zeitgeist in a way of people discovering and like treasure digging for good content that's been overlooked and maybe abandoned, maybe stuff that we ourselves heard of or even attempted in high school and didn't find appealing, and now we're kind of returning to see if it's and finding new value in them, and it's a very exciting time.
So Matt, where can people find you? Where can they find your work?
Follow me on X, because I'm being the poster there. I don't typically have the time to make content, though I as far as YouTube goes, but I very much appreciate being guests on YouTube shows. You could find me at Matt Crotts, and I promise to give you interesting esoteric history posts and occasionally give you updates on Kyrie Book 4, which is coming soon.
I will also link to buy the books. You can get both a digital and physical copy. They're pretty reasonable, even by the standards of indie publishing. Check those out. As far as my stuff, Jay Burden Show, Apple, Spotify, YouTube, anywhere you listen to podcasts. If you want to support me, because this is what I do full time, you can throw me a few bucks a month on Patreon, Substack, or Gumroad. You'll get the episodes early and ad-free. or you can check out our sponsor, Axios Remote Fitness Coaching. I found out what other people who do coaching charge, and I am genuinely morally affronted. I've been using JD for 3 years, so I don't know what the market rate is. But JD is a really good deal. Like by like a factor of 3 or 4x, he's a very good deal. So check him out. I use it 4 times a week. He's a friend of mine. Look, I don't have any other sponsors because he's the one sponsor that I think is worth it. Anyway, Matt, I appreciate it. And to everyone at home, keep your head up. Life can't last forever.